Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to matter as much as everyone else around you? This is Sarah's story, and perhaps it's yours too. Sarah Martinez lived in the gentle hills of Northern California, where the morning fog would roll in like a soft blanket over her small apartment in San Jose. At 37, she had learned to navigate life quietly, always stepping aside, always making room for others. But this story isn't about stepping aside anymore. This is about what happens when a woman finally decides that her life, her dreams, and her happiness matter just as much as everyone else's. Growing up in what appeared to be a picture-perfect suburban home in Palo Alto, Sarah had always been the daughter who faded into the background. Her older sister Rebecca was 44 now and had been the shining star of the Martinez family for as long as anyone could remember. Rebecca was the one whose artwork adorned every wall, whose achievements filled every conversation at family dinners, whose life became the central theme around which the entire family revolved. Sarah often wondered if this was just how families worked, if perhaps she simply wasn't meant to be seen in the same light. The walls of their childhood home told the story clearly enough. Rebecca's debate team certificates hung in golden frames in the living room. Her college acceptance letters were displayed in the hallway, and even her childhood drawings were carefully preserved and mounted throughout the house. Sarah's accomplishments, when they existed at all, were relegated to the refrigerator door with simple magnets, if they were acknowledged at all. The pattern had been established early and reinforced with each passing year. When Sarah turned 12, her birthday fell on the same week that Rebecca was preparing for her college interviews. Their parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, were so consumed with helping Rebecca practice for her interviews that they forgot to buy a cake for Sarah's birthday. Sarah still remembered sitting at the kitchen table that evening, watching her mother hastily place candles on top of Rebecca's leftover graduation cake from the week before. The name Rebecca was still faintly visible under the hasty layer of frosting that was meant to cover it. That night, Sarah learned that sometimes love comes secondhand, and sometimes that has to be enough. She blew out the candles anyway and made a wish that someday, somewhere, someone would remember her birthday without being reminded. As the years passed, this pattern became as natural as breathing in the Martinez household. When Sarah made honor roll in middle school, the family dinner conversation remained focused on Rebecca's upcoming debate competition. When Sarah won a local art competition in high school, her parents were touring college campuses with Rebecca and missed the awards ceremony entirely. Sarah learned to celebrate her victories alone in her room, looking at her certificate in the mirror and imagining what it might have felt like to see pride in her parents' eyes. She would practice acceptance speeches to her reflection, thanking imaginary supporters who believed in her work. These moments of solitary celebration became sacred to her, small rituals of self-acknowledgement that kept her spirit alive even when the world seemed to overlook her completely. The distribution of resources in the Martinez household reflected these same priorities with heartbreaking clarity. Rebecca's room was filled with the latest technology, designer clothes, and everything she needed for her extensive extracurricular activities. She had her own laptop, a professional easel for art classes, expensive athletic equipment, and shelves lined with new textbooks and supplies. Sarah's room, by contrast, was furnished with hand-me-downs and whatever was left after Rebecca's needs were met. When Sarah expressed interest in learning violin, she was given Rebecca's abandoned instrument, which was far too large for her small hands. When she asked if they could get her a properly sized violin, her mother's response was gentle but firm. "We already spent so much on Rebecca's piano lessons this year. Maybe next year we can think about it." Next year never came, and Sarah eventually gave up trying to make music with an instrument that didn't fit her. The financial inequities continued throughout their childhood and became even more pronounced during their college years. Rebecca had received a full ride to a prestigious university, with their parents providing additional support for living expenses, study abroad programs, and internship opportunities. When it came time for Sarah's college applications, the conversation was markedly different. Her parents sat her down at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and calculators, explaining that they could only contribute half of the tuition costs for a state school. They were still paying off Rebecca's student loans, they explained, and Sarah would need to figure out the rest on her own. Sarah worked 2 part-time jobs throughout college, often falling asleep over her textbooks after 12-hour days of classes and work. She watched her classmates participate in study groups and campus activities while she served coffee at the campus cafe or shelved books at the library, trying to make enough money to stay in school. Meanwhile, Rebecca was beginning her career in marketing, landing her first job through connections their parents had helped her cultivate during college. The Martinez family network had opened doors for Rebecca that Sarah didn't even know existed. When Rebecca announced her engagement 7 years ago, the family's attention once again centered entirely on her needs and desires. For an entire year, every conversation, every family gathering, every phone call revolved around wedding planning. Rebecca's vision for her perfect day included a designer gown, an elaborate venue, and a guest list of over 300 people. Despite their concerns about taking on debt, Maria and Carlos took out a loan to ensure that nothing would be too good for Rebecca's special day. Sarah was expected to serve as maid of honor, a role that came with an extensive list of unpaid responsibilities, including coordinating bridal showers, planning a lavish bachelorette party, and managing any crisis that arose during the year-long planning process. When Sarah expressed feeling overwhelmed by these obligations while working a demanding full-time job, her mother's response was swift and predictable. "Don't be selfish, Sarah. This is your sister's special time." The word selfish hung in the air like incense at a funeral, marking the death of Sarah's right to have needs or boundaries of her own. She learned that wanting time for herself, wanting recognition for her own life, wanting anything that didn't directly serve Rebecca's happiness was labeled as selfishness. This lesson would be reinforced countless times over the years that followed, each instance teaching Sarah that her worth was measured by her usefulness to others, particularly to Rebecca. When Rebecca announced her pregnancy with twins 3 years later, the family's excitement reached new heights. Despite still repaying the wedding loan, Maria and Carlos contributed to the down payment on a house near their own home, ensuring that their grandchildren would be close by. Sarah watched her parents access retirement funds that they had claimed were unavailable when she needed help with college expenses. The day they signed those financial documents, they explained to Sarah that this situation was different because it was for their grandchildren, as if her education had been a luxury, rather than an investment in a human being's future. The twins became the center of the family universe before they were even born, and Sarah found herself cast in a new role that would define the next several years of her life: the permanent unpaid babysitter. What began as occasional babysitting requests quickly evolved into a complex system of expectations and obligations that consumed Sarah's weekends and evenings. Rebecca would call with increasingly frequent requests that always seemed urgent. Could Sarah watch the boys for just a few hours while she ran essential errands? Could Sarah take them for the evening while she and her husband Mark attended important social functions? Could Sarah keep them overnight because she desperately needed alone time with Mark? Each request was presented as a crisis that only Sarah could solve, and refusing felt tantamount to destroying her sister's well-being and the family's stability. Sarah adored her nephews, 7-year-old Diego and Miguel, but caring for two energetic children while working a full-time job in marketing was physically and emotionally exhausting. The routine became as predictable as it was draining. Every Friday evening, Rebecca would appear at Sarah's apartment with the boys and their overnight bags, usually with a story about unexpected plans or overwhelming stress that required Sarah's immediate assistance. The twins would transform Sarah's carefully organized space into a whirlwind of toys, snacks, and childhood chaos that took hours to clean up after they left. When Sarah attempted to establish boundaries or request advance notice for babysitting, Rebecca would break down in tears, explaining how overwhelmed she was as a mother and how much she needed Sarah's support. These emotional displays always ended with their parents calling Sarah to express their disappointment in her lack of family loyalty and support for her sister during this challenging time in her life. Sarah's career advancement had stalled during these years of constant availability for family obligations. When she received a promotion offer that included greater responsibility and more travel opportunities, the family reaction was immediate and negative. Her mother's first question was, "What about the twins?" And Rebecca added that Sarah couldn't possibly take a position that would make her less available to help with the boys. The promotion represented everything Sarah had worked toward in her marketing career, but the family treated it as a betrayal of her duties as an aunt and sister. Her father's contribution to the conversation was equally dismissive. Family should always come first. "Sarah, and your sister has 2 children to think about." When Sarah tried to explain how important this career opportunity was to her, Rebecca's response cut deepest of all: "You're just bitter because you're still single." As if Sarah's marital status somehow disqualified her from having professional ambitions or personal goals that mattered. After a particularly exhausting weekend of caring for the twins, during which they managed to spill juice on her laptop and leave permanent marker stains on her couch, Sarah made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She booked a solo vacation to a small beach resort in Monterey, a place where she could finally be alone with her thoughts and remember who she was beyond her role as the family's permanent helper. When she mentioned this plan during their weekly family dinner, her mother's eyes immediately lit up with an idea that filled Sarah with dread. "Oh, that sounds wonderful. We should all go together. The boys would love the beach. Before Sarah could protest, Rebecca was already making plans, discussing how Sarah could watch the twins while she and Mark enjoyed some couple time, as if Sarah's vacation was naturally designed to provide them with childcare services. The family began planning activities and accommodations around what would be fun for the children, completely ignoring the fact that this was meant to be Sarah's personal retreat. Her parents even offered to upgrade the reservation to a more expensive resort where they could all stay together, entirely missing the point that Sarah needed space and solitude. The assumption that her vacation would automatically include babysitting duties was presented as natural and generous, as if they were doing her a favor by allowing her to care for the twins in a more scenic location. That night, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of the city outside her window, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. In secret, she booked a completely different trip to a quiet resort in Big Sur, a place known for its healing energy and peaceful solitude. She applied for time off from work without telling her family, arranged her finances carefully, and began preparing for what felt like the most rebellious act of her 37 years. She knew that when her family arrived at the airport expecting to travel together, they would discover that she had made different plans, that for the first time in her adult life, she had chosen herself over their expectations and demands. The thought of their reaction filled her with both terror and something that felt like freedom, a sensation so foreign that she barely recognized it. On the morning of departure, Sarah arrived at the airport early and watched from a distance as her family gathered at their designated meeting point. She saw her parents looking excited about the family trip, Rebecca managing the twins and their extensive luggage, and Mark checking travel documents with the efficiency of someone accustomed to having family support for every expedition. As they began moving toward their check-in counter, Sarah quietly proceeded to her own gate for a flight in the opposite direction. Her phone remained silent until they realized she wasn't at their departure gate, and then it began buzzing with increasingly frantic messages. The texts progressed from confused inquiries about her location to panicked questions about her safety, and finally to angry accusations about her selfishness and thoughtlessness. Rebecca sent voice messages describing how the twins were crying for their Aunt Sarah, how the trip was ruined without her, and how Sarah had destroyed what was supposed to be a beautiful family bonding experience. Before boarding her flight, Sarah turned off her phone and experienced something she hadn't felt in years. The pure, terrifying, exhilarating sensation of choosing her own path without considering anyone else's needs or expectations first. The resort in Big Sur was everything Sarah had hoped it would be, and more. Nestled among ancient redwood trees with views of the Pacific Ocean, it offered the kind of profound quiet that allows a person to hear their own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. The first 2 days were more difficult than she had anticipated, as decades of conditioning made her constantly check the time and worry about what her family might need. She found herself automatically calculating when the twins would need lunch or when Rebecca might require assistance, before remembering that for the first time in years, those concerns were not hers to carry. On the third day, something shifted inside Sarah's consciousness, like a door opening in a house she thought she knew completely. She signed up for a surfing lesson, something she had always wanted to try, but never had time for when her weekends belonged to everyone else. Standing on the board in the gentle waves of the California coast, she felt a connection to her own strength and capability that had been dormant for years. She enrolled in a beachside yoga class where she met other solo travelers, women who spoke about their own journeys toward self-discovery and independence with a wisdom that resonated deep in Sarah's chest. One evening, she had dinner with a fascinating man she met at the resort's coffee shop, a writer from Portland who was taking a similar solo retreat to work on his novel. Their conversation flowed naturally from books to travel to dreams, and Sarah realized with surprise that she could be interesting and engaged when she wasn't constantly distracted by family obligations. The dinner was casual and friendly, but it served as a powerful reminder that she was capable of forming connections and relationships outside of her prescribed role as the family's support system. When Sarah finally turned her phone back on after 5 days of intentional disconnection, she was greeted with an overwhelming avalanche of missed calls, text messages, and voicemails. Her mother had even called Sarah's workplace to report a family emergency, though fortunately, Sarah had informed her supervisor about her vacation plans before leaving. The progression of voicemails told a story of emotions ranging from concern to anger to manipulation. Her mother's messages evolved from worried inquiries about Sarah's safety to angry demands for an explanation of her behavior to guilt-laden pleas about the twins asking for their aunt. Rebecca's messages were particularly painful, filled with accusations about ruined family bonding time and descriptions of how difficult it was to manage the children alone while Mark had to cut short his work meetings to help with childcare. But it was her father's message that affected Sarah most deeply, because for the first time in memory, he sounded uncertain and vulnerable rather than authoritative. He asked her to let them know she was safe and said that although he didn't understand what was happening, he wanted her to come home. It was the first time Sarah could remember her father speaking to her without immediately defending Rebecca or pressuring her to do more for the family. Instead of responding with lengthy explanations or apologies, Sarah sent a single message to the family group chat. "I'm safe and having a wonderful vacation. I'll be in touch when I return. Please respect my need for space right now." Then she turned off the conversation notifications and continued with her retreat. The remaining days of her trip were transformational in ways that surprised her. Instead of reading bedtime stories to the twins, she read 3 novels for her own pleasure. Instead of rushing home to help with bath time and bedtime routines, she watched the sunset from the beach each evening, journaling about feelings and dreams that had been buried under years of family obligations. The simple act of eating dinner alone without interruption became a meditation on what she had been missing in her life. She spoke with other guests about their travels, their careers, their passions, and realized how long it had been since anyone had asked about her interests or goals without immediately redirecting the conversation to family needs. An elderly waitress at a small beachside restaurant noticed that Sarah was dining alone and asked if she was enjoying her solitude. After Sarah shared a brief explanation of her circumstances, the woman offered wisdom that would stay with her. "Family is important, honey, but not at the expense of your own well-being. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is put yourself first." Rather than returning directly home, Sarah decided to extend her journey of self-discovery by staying in a hotel for 2 additional nights. She used this time to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with her family, updating her emergency contacts at work, changing the locks on her apartment, and most importantly, writing down the boundaries she intended to establish. She had learned from years of therapy articles and self-help books that boundaries without consequences are merely suggestions, so she prepared herself mentally for the difficult conversations ahead. A social media mishap revealed her location when she accidentally liked a coworker's post, alerting her family to the fact that she had returned to the Bay Area. Within hours, her mother and Rebecca were outside her apartment building, repeatedly buzzing her intercom with the desperate persistence of people accustomed to getting their way through sheer intensity. From her the next, she arrived when her mother surprised throughout the pivotal. She looked the silence she described. She showed when her the after a implement she moved. Although rebuilding her social life from scratch was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her transformation. Years of being perpetually available for family needs had prevented her from developing close friendships or pursuing personal interests. She began slowly and intentionally enrolling in pottery classes where she discovered a talent for creating beautiful, functional art with her hands. She joined a local book club where intellectual conversations about literature replaced the endless family drama that had consumed so many of her evenings. When coworkers invited her to dinner or weekend activities, she accepted invitations that she had previously declined automatically due to babysitting obligations. The first weekend of complete freedom felt almost surreal in its ordinary extraordinariness. Sarah slept late without guilt, visited a farmer's market without checking her phone for urgent family messages, and spent hours browsing a bookstore without worrying about when she needed to be somewhere else for someone else's needs. For the first time in years, her schedule belonged entirely to her, filled with activities that brought her joy rather than obligations that drained her energy. She discovered that she enjoyed hiking in the nearby hills, that she had a genuine talent for cooking when she wasn't rushed, and that she could spend entire afternoons reading without feeling selfish or lazy. Her family's response to her relocation was predictable but no longer devastating. When her mother attempted to contact her through the company switchboard, Sarah's workplace informed the caller that personal calls were not permitted during business hours, a policy that protected her from emotional manipulation while she was trying to work. Rebecca made one dramatic appearance at Sarah's office, but security had been alerted to the possibility of family drama and handled the situation professionally. Rebecca left a tearful letter accusing Sarah of destroying their family and abandoning her responsibilities as a sister and aunt, but the words no longer carried the power to send Sarah spiraling into guilt and self-doubt. An unexpected development came in the form of an apologetic email from Mark, who acknowledged his role in enabling the exploitation of Sarah's availability and expressed genuine remorse for not recognizing how unfair their expectations had been. He reported that Rebecca had initially objected to him taking on more weekend responsibilities with the twins, but she was beginning to adjust to a more equitable distribution of childcare duties. While this was a relatively small change in the larger family dynamic, it represented progress toward a healthier balance of responsibilities that didn't automatically fall on Sarah's shoulders. Her parents struggled significantly with adjusting to Sarah's independence. Her father occasionally sent awkward text messages attempting to initiate normal conversation, usually about neutral topics like the weather or local news. Her mother alternated between angry outbursts and periods of icy silence, leaving voicemails that ranged from furious accusations to cold statements about welcoming Sarah back when she was done with her rebellion phase. The word rebellion particularly irritated Sarah because it implied that her desire for autonomy and respect was merely a temporary phase rather than a legitimate transformation into healthy adulthood. The changes in Sarah's professional life were remarkable and immediate. Without the constant background anxiety of family obligations and emergency babysitting requests, she found herself more focused and productive at work than she had been in years. Her supervisor noticed the improvement and assigned her to lead a major new project, a responsibility that had been out of reach when her personal life was consumed by family drama. For the first time in years, Sarah felt capable of taking on challenges and pursuing opportunities without worrying about how they might conflict with her family's expectations and demands. She also began dating casually, something that had been nearly impossible when her weekends belonged to the twins and her emotional energy was constantly drained by family obligations. Meeting new people and forming connections based on genuine compatibility rather than duty was revelatory for someone who had spent years believing that her primary value lay in her usefulness to others. Sarah approached these new relationships slowly and carefully, having learned that healthy connections require boundaries and mutual respect rather than endless self-sacrifice and availability. According to her therapist, whom Sarah had finally been able to start seeing regularly now that her schedule was her own, she was experiencing what professionals call post-traumatic growth. This wasn't simply about moving past the dysfunction of her family relationships, but about building something stronger and healthier in place of the patterns that had kept her trapped for decades. Therapy helped Sarah understand that she was not responsible for fixing or managing her family's emotional and practical needs, and that setting boundaries was not selfish, but necessary for her psychological well-being. The twins sent her a package last weekend containing handmade cards expressing how much they missed their aunt. Gifts that were clearly supervised and possibly dictated by adults who hoped to manipulate Sarah's emotions. While the gesture was bittersweet, Sarah remained firm in her resolution to prioritize her own healing and growth. She wrote them a gentle but clear letter explaining that although she loved them very much, she needed time to take care of herself, and that sometimes grown-ups need space to become the best version of themselves. She knew that Rebecca was unlikely to read this letter to them, but she needed to write it for her own clarity and peace of mind. 3 months into her new life, Sarah faced the confrontation she had been both dreading and anticipating. Her father appeared unexpectedly at her workplace, but his approach was different from Rebecca's emotional manipulations or her mother's angry demands. He asked calmly if they could have lunch together, and something in his demeanor suggested that this conversation might be different from their previous interactions. They met at a peaceful restaurant near her office, and for the first time in Sarah's memory, her father seemed to truly see her as an individual rather than as Rebecca's sister or the family's support system. He told her that she looked healthy and happier, an observation that seemed to surprise him with its implications. The family had prepared what he described as a proposal, offering certain compromises if Sarah would agree to resume her previous role in their lives. They were willing to limit babysitting requests to every other weekend, and they had even discussed paying Sarah for her time with the twins, as if financial compensation could address the fundamental lack of respect and appreciation that had characterized their treatment of her. As her father outlined this proposal, Sarah realized with crystal clarity that they still didn't understand the true nature of the problem. When he finished presenting their offer, Sarah looked directly at him and said something that had been building inside her for 37 years. "Dad, I'm not negotiating my freedom. I'm living it." The conversation that followed was the most honest exchange they had ever had, with Sarah describing not just the practical inequities of their family dynamics, but the emotional impact of feeling invisible and undervalued for most of her life. She shared memories he had forgotten or perhaps never noticed, dreams that were dismissed, accomplishments that were overlooked, and the gradual erosion of her sense of self-worth under the constant message that her needs mattered less than everyone else's. Her father's reaction surprised her with its depth and genuineness. Instead of immediately defending the family's choices or making excuses for their behavior, he sat quietly for a long time, processing what she had shared with him. Finally, he said something that acknowledged her experience in a way she had never heard before. "We thought we were doing what was best for the family, but we never saw how much we were hurting you." While this wasn't exactly an apology, it was the first time anyone in her family had validated her feelings and acknowledged the impact of their choices on her well-being. When her father asked about her new life, Sarah found herself sharing details about her pottery classes, her work advancement, and the friendships she was building with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. She showed him pictures of a vase she had created and was moved by his genuine interest in her artistic development. Most surprisingly, he said something that recognized her growth and independence. "You seem to have built a good life for yourself without us." There was both acknowledgement and sadness in his voice, as if he was finally understanding what they had lost by failing to value and support her as an individual. At the end of their lunch, they agreed that their relationship would never return to its previous pattern, but they also acknowledged the possibility of building something new and healthier in the future. Her father gave her the first sincere embrace she had received from him in years and said something that gave Sarah hope for eventual reconciliation on healthier terms. "I hope someday we can be part of your life again, but on different terms." This exchange seemed to trigger a final wave of family resistance, with her mother launching renewed emotional attacks and Rebecca making passive-aggressive social media posts about selfish sisters and broken families. The difference was that none of these tactics had the same impact on Sarah that they would have had a year earlier. Her new life had given her a perspective and strength that made their manipulation attempts feel desperate rather than devastating. She understood now that their reactions were attempts to maintain control over someone who had finally claimed her own power and autonomy. Her apartment felt like home in a way that no living space ever had before, decorated with her pottery creations and photographs of friends who valued her independence and respected her boundaries. The most profound change was in Sarah's relationship with time itself. Her weekends now belonged entirely to her, filled with hiking adventures, Spanish language classes, and the simple pleasure of reading without interruption. She had begun dating someone who respected her boundaries and appreciated her strength rather than seeking to exploit her availability. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was creating an existence that reflected her true values and desires rather than everyone else's expectations and demands. When the twins sent her another supervised message last Sunday, this time in the form of a homemade card filled with carefully coached statements about missing their aunt, Sarah felt sadness, but not the crushing guilt that would have sent her running back to her old patterns. Instead, she responded with a gentle but firm letter, explaining that her love for them remained unchanged even though her involvement in their daily lives had necessarily decreased, and that sometimes adults need to take care of themselves in order to be the best version of themselves for everyone they love. Her therapist helped her understand that she was not just recovering from years of emotional neglect and exploitation, but actively building what she called a life of authentic choice, rather than obligation. Sarah was learning the difference between love that requires constant self-sacrifice and love that encourages mutual growth and respect. She was discovering that healthy relationships involve reciprocal support rather than one-sided service, and that her worth as a person was not determined by her usefulness to others, but by her inherent value as a human being. Yesterday brought the most recent development in her family situation, when Mark contacted her privately to share how her stand for independence had created positive changes in their household. Not to blame her for the disruption, he was careful to clarify, but to thank her for forcing them to confront problems they had been avoiding for years. They had finally hired part-time help with childcare, and Mark had become a more involved and present parent rather than relying on extended family to manage his responsibilities. He admitted that Kate was struggling with these adjustments, but he believed the changes were healthier for everyone involved, including the children who were learning that multiple adults could provide care and support rather than depending entirely on Aunt Sarah's availability. As Sarah sits in her home office this evening, preparing for a business trip that represents new opportunities in her marketing career, she reflects on how completely her life has been transformed by the simple act of choosing herself. A framed quotation hangs on the wall behind her desk, words that have become her personal manifesto. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is set yourself free." The business trip would have been impossible during her years of constant family availability, but now it represents growth and adventure rather than conflict and guilt. To anyone who might be living in a similar situation, feeling invisible in their own families or wondering if they're selfish for wanting their own lives to matter, Sarah's story offers this gentle but powerful message. You are not being selfish for desiring recognition, respect, and space for your own dreams to flourish. Choosing yourself is not unkind. Setting boundaries is not betrayal. And creating a life that honors your own needs and values is not rebellion but revolution. The quiet revolution of a woman who finally understands that her happiness matters as much as everyone else's. Sarah doesn't know how her relationship with her family will evolve in the future. Perhaps they will eventually find a way to connect that honors everyone's autonomy and worth. Perhaps they will learn to love without demanding constant sacrifice. In the meantime, she is focused on nurturing the life she has built, including the friendships that celebrate her independence, the work that challenges her capabilities, the creative pursuits that feed her soul, and above all, the relationship with herself that has become the foundation for everything else. This is not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a life lived according to her own values rather than everyone else's expectations. For the first time in 37 years, Sarah Martinez is looking forward to her future with excitement rather than resignation. Knowing that whatever comes next, she will face it as a woman who has learned that the most important relationship she can nurture is the one with herself. And that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is the example of a person who has learned to value themselves enough to demand better treatment from the world.